So I'm going to quickly introduce two of them. We have a third one that's hopefully joining us soon, which I announced a little bit ago. And when he comes in, we'll adjust and allow him to jump into the conversation. So right here we have Suad Aziz, who's the executive director of Decolonize Sudan and a human rights lawyer. And then we have Cameron Hudson, who's a senior associate in the Africa Center at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And the way that we're going to be doing the discussion today is we're going to start with about an hour or so of questions from me to our panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, which will be led by Mab Suleiman, who is a senior at UNC Chapel Hill studying public health and a Sudanese American organizer in the Triangle. She's also the president of the Sudanese Youth Network. All right, so we'll jump in with the first question. So this is to the both of you, and either one of you can start first. Many people describe Sudan's crisis as underreported. What is the biggest misconceptions that the international community has right now? And what is one key point that you want us to keep in mind during our conversation today?
Sure, I'll start. So I'll speak to the misconceptions. So the around public consciousnness and also international leadership in the global community. There is this, when we talk about anti-Blackness, when it comes to the underreporting, comes to the not only ignoring this crisis, but actively obfuscating this crisis, we can attribute much of that to these tropes around African conflict. That given that this is a conflict happening in Africa, that there is this trope around Africans fighting amongst themselves, and therefore the real dimensions of this conflict, the actors involved, why they are doing this, and what the goals, ultimate goals of this genocide are. All of that is dismissed through this lens of the parties on the ground. There's this internal conflict. A lot of that has to do with the parties on the ground all look the same to a Western audience, especially to a non-Sudanese audience. There is this, there's this conception that of a civil war, of an internal conflict. And Sudan is often framed around chaos, around unexplained humanitarian crisis, that somehow, a natural disaster has been, that the Sudan has been afflicted with a natural disaster. And there's this unexplained crisis, all of the largest displacement crisis, the largest crisis happening on Earth today, that is explained away or ignored. The reasoning and the actors involved are ignored. Sudan is not randomly collapsing because of internal divisions. It is being targeted. It is being targeted for its resources, for its strategic position, and for its politics, for its radical politics, and the people's resistance to neo-colonial rule. Sudan has been almost completely destabilized. Most vital infrastructure across the country has been destroyed. The people have been exterminated and cleansed from their land. This is one of the largest mass displacements that have happened in modern history. This is being done by the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, a private militia that is made up of mostly foreign mercenaries backed by a foreign state, the United Arab Emirates, which has been the operational hub of this militia. The UAE has now faced with a mountain of evidence, with a UN panel of experts, with independent reporting, including Nathaniel of Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab's really extensive satellite imagery reporting and investigative journalism amongst all mainstream outlets, and even UAE leadership themselves now saying, yes, we are involved in Sudan, but we're one of many actors. We're, the surrounding African countries are all involved, and so this is just a messy civil war. I want us to understand when I say that the UAE is an operational hub of the RSF militia, that means that every element of RSF operations goes through the UAE. Those weapons that come in through Chad, those are paid for and routed by the UAE. The RSF training camp in Ethiopia that has now been corroborated by Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, that is maintained by UAE supply lines. The fighters that are coming out of Somalia and into Sudan, those are transported by UAE chartered flights and made possible through UAE-led fragmentation of Somalia, Somaliland and Puntland. So this is not a confusing conflict. It's not some type of tribal warfare. It is a deliberate project of destruction backed and sustained by identifiable actors and identified actors. And if we keep calling it a civil war, like the Western mainstream media has maintained around the Sudanese narrative, we are not only misunderstanding it, but we are helping this genocide and this illegal occupation by a non-state armed group continue to occur. So I want to be very intentional with our language around Sudan, and there's very clear reasons why we are clear with our language. My background is a legal background. I'm a lawyer, and an advocate, and there are these. I'm a bit starstruck now. Nathaniel has entered the room.
How are you doing?
Hello, it's me.
Hi.
Pleasure to meet you.
It's great to see you.
But there are different sets of legal responsibilities, of obligations of states, of obligations of these non-state armed groups. When you call it what it is, when you call it proxy warfare, when you call it a siege, a neo-colonial siege, and a siege by an unauthorized non-state armed group, and its foreign backers. And so I'll end there, but very eager to be in conversation with you all, and I thank you all for your advocacy for Sudan.
And I'm just going to introduce very quickly Nathaniel Raymond, Executive Director of Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab and Human Rights Investigator. So I've shouted him out a few times in her introductory remarks. We just got started with the first question, so you're actually right on time. We started with the question just to reiterate, many people describe Sudan's crisis as underreported. What are the biggest misconceptions that the international community has right now, and what is one key point that we should keep in mind to contextualize today's discussion? So I've pointed to a lot of, she gave a very rich answer, pointed to a lot of things you should keep in mind, language setting, anti-Blackness contributions to underreporting, the way that we frame the conflict of whether or not we should call it a civil war or recognize the deeper involved actors that are at play. Cameron, if you want to go next, since we give the thing a little bit of time with this phone, let's hear your response.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me tonight, this conversation. I would just preface my remarks by kind of giving my bias is always sort of what is the view of Washington. I spent most of my career in the US government working on Sudan issues. And so and now being in a Washington think tank, my perspective is always, I think, informed much more by the constraints and incentives of the US government. And I think that's one of the contributions I can make to these kinds of conversations. And so when I think about it in that perspective, I think that the conflict in Sudan is not unlike other conflicts in Africa with respect to how much attention or how much policy priority it gets. Even though, as has already been mentioned, it's the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today, the largest displacement crisis in the world today. So the kind of superlatives around the conflict are unparalleled right now, right? So, if this was happening in another country, in a Western country, in a white country, then yes, it would probably be receiving substantially more, not just press coverage or public attention, but attention from our policymakers, which it's not. But I can also say that speaking as someone who worked on Sudan in the U.S. government for 20 years, I can say that it is always a struggle to get that kind of senior level attention on conflicts in Africa, conflicts that we don't fundamentally understand, either because we haven't spent the time or because they are complicated in ways that we haven't, fully grappled with many times. And so, yes, the conflict in Sudan is underreported. I tend to dismiss the arguments, though, that it's underreported because we are overly focused on Gaza or on Ukraine or on Venezuela or on Iran. That is all true. But there have been moments in time when we have been able to concentrate our attention, our public advocacy, and our resources to end conflicts in Africa and to end conflicts in Sudan. And we did those at a time when we were fighting wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and when 9/11 was happening, and so we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can be preoccupied with larger strategic conflicts that involve oil and gas and the deployment of U.S. troops, and we can do those things, and we can pay attention to conflicts in Africa and conflicts in Sudan. We are not doing that now. And even when we did it before, it's not easy. It has taken a large amount of public pressure, oftentimes, to bring policymakers to prioritize that issue. That's not something that is happening right now, and we can talk about why there isn't more advocacy on college campuses or advocacy, on the editorial pages of major newspapers right now, which there has been less of, I think, in this conflict than in previous conflicts in Sudan. But the fact is that it's always a struggle to get attention on these conflicts when what a U.S. policymaker would say doesn't involve kind of first order national security priorities, right? There's no nuclear weapons. We don't buy oil from Sudan. They would say that yes, the humanitarian imperatives are great, and we should, as a Christian nation or as a nation that is concerned about humanitarian crises in the world, we should pay more attention to that. But that is never sufficient to motivate the kind of either diplomatic response or humanitarian response that is typically required to resolve something as complicated as is happening in Sudan today. I think so. That's on the sort of the public perception side, and is it getting enough attention? On the kind of on the sort of what's misunderstood about the conflict. I mean, I would associate myself with everything that's been said already about the RSF and the support for this war from regional states. I think that there has been an effort by the United States government in the Trump administration in the last 6 months, 12 months, a modest effort to try to advance a ceasefire and to advance efforts towards creating humanitarian corridors and a humanitarian truce in the conflict. I think you're seeing the effects of a very inexperienced diplomatic team that the Trump administration has put in place to try to engineer those objectives and those goals. But they're not paying attention to what's going on. I don't happen to believe that their efforts are particularly effective, or that they have constructed the right team of people to achieve what they say they want to achieve. But there is some amount of effort that is going towards this conflict. But what I would say is, unlike previous conflicts in the region and in Sudan, this really has become a kind of world war, right? Where you have essentially every neighboring state that touches Sudan involved in some way in this war on one side or the other, whether it is smuggling weapons, soldiers, money. Then you have a whole host of, sort of regional actors, and some of whom are incredibly wealthy, as has been discussed about, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait. I mean, everybody has had some role to play in this conflict, let alone the Chinese, the Russians, and the United States. So there is this kind of concentric circles of influence that are bearing down on this conflict. And to the extent that the United States is trying to resolve things, I would say that they're trying to manage this conflict and not resolve the conflict. And I think what's misunderstood is just that we are not actually trying to engage either of the parties to the conflict. What we are trying to do is manage the ambitions of our friends and partners. We want UAE and Saudi and Egypt to just get along and not compete over the spoils of war in Sudan and pick winners. And we're, I think, from the Trump administration, relatively agnostic about what Sudan looks like at the end of this war. The only thing that is motivating the Trump administration right now is preventing something worse from happening. We want to prevent Sudan from becoming a failed state. We want to prevent the partition of Sudan. We want to prevent Sudan from having Islamist government return. We want to prevent Sudan from cooperating with the Houthis or the Iranians or the Russians. We have no prospective vision for what we want to achieve in Sudan. We are not talking to civilians in Sudan. We are not talking to youth in Sudan. We are not talking to politicians in Sudan, trying to restart a revolution that was snuffed out at the start of this war. We have no vision for what we want to achieve. And I think that achieving a ceasefire is a good and important objective, but it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for actually having peace in the country. And that conversation, I think, is being largely ignored, both by our policymakers and by the public.
I want to make 4 points. Before I do, I want to totally agree with what Cameron said on US policy being focused on what it doesn't want to have happen and on separating two kids having a fight on the block, UAE and Saudi Arabia, to try to keep two US allies from escalating to something worse. So 4 points. Frederick Douglass, in writing about the abolition of slavery, wrote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and never will." And the fact of the matter is, 20 years ago, in the first Darfur genocide, we had a funded infrastructure in the Save Darfur movement that created a demand domestically for American policymakers. And that was a diverse coalition of American evangelicals, of folks like you, students, and celebrities, and a variety of faith communities and social economic groups in the United States. And that was heard by a Republican administration and by a Democratic administration. That has not existed here. There has been no demand from the American public for a specific policy on Sudan, and it reflects that. The second point is, having served as a sub-implementer to the State Department with our team at Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale, we were part of the negotiation support unit to the first Jeddah negotiations, and we monitored the first Jeddah declaration ceasefire for the State Department. And so I had a seat, a ringside seat for how that initial ceasefire negotiation was constructed. And not much, some things have changed, but nothing has really fundamentally changed in the fundamental fatal flaws. And that speaks to Cameron's point that who hasn't been taken? Sudanese civil society, Sudanese politicians. It has been always formatted as an RSF-SAF negotiation. And it has been an RSF staff negotiation, this is my third point, with one of the parties, RSF, using time and again, and you can set your watch by it, humanitarian ceasefire negotiations to either launch an offensive, complete an offensive, start a massacre, or complete a massacre. They have played the international community, like Patsy's, by using the humanitarian ceasefire dangle as a way to have cover for action during some of their most grievous attacks, including Al Fasher with the Quad and the Al Fasher massacre, but also with Zelenji and Hadassah camp, Al Janena. We can go back and look at where RSF made a move and really synchronize that to how they were using a promise of humanitarian pause participation. And then the last point is this, is that I think one of the things that people don't understand about this conflict is, I would say that all wars are a mirror of the rest of the world. And right now, Sudan is a mirror that shows something much larger than the Sudan conflict, which is the consequences of the deterioration of the viability of the UN Security Council, the deterioration of the meaning of international humanitarian law and the laws of war, LOAC, and the deterioration of international norms around CIVPRO, civilian protection, and the responsibility to protect. We no longer have to say this ... might happen if you walk away from these norms. No, Sudan is happening the way it's happened because we have walked away from those norms, those institutions, those mechanisms. And fundamentally, that means when you don't put those things, we can critique them, we can talk about their insufficiencies, their inadequacies, their failings. But when you don't talk about Security Council approach, when you don't talk about peacekeeping operations, you end up with ASAP RSF binary negotiation with no vision of a transitional government. And here we are.
Thank you all. I think that was such a solid foundation for us to get the conversation started. And Nathaniel, you actually kind of started treading into the waters in the next question of what distinguishes this crisis in Darfur in the early 2000s and what lessons were not learned. She talked a little bit about the fact that there was a well-funded movement, the Save Darfur movement, that involved students, evangelical Christians alike, and had a really powerful collective movement within and democratic legislators in our state or in our country. I wanted to see if either of y'all wanted to add to that question, but if not, we could go to the next one.
Well, so what distinguishes what has happened in the past in Sudan, throughout Sudan's history, and when April 2023 onward, where the RSF siege on Sudan began, is that it is fundamentally different in terms of the broader picture, actors and goals. What is happening now is an attempt to take over the entirety of the country, orchestrated by a foreign power in order to enrich that foreign power, versus a subjugation of an entire region in Sudan in order to maintain control of the resource-rich land and assets, resources, and ensure that the population would not rise up against the government. A subjugation of a population through genocide versus a complete annihilation and genocide and attempted takeover of an entire country. When we talk about scale, I want to emphasize the scale of what has happened in the past 3 years. So the high-end numbers of deaths around the genocide in Darfur throughout a 6-year period was 300,000. Around that many people were cleared from El Fasher, one city in Darfur, in a matter of 3 days. The RSF displaced, disappeared, and were massacred almost the entirety of this city, and leading up to this siege, massacred with the numbers having surpassed this in the numbers leading up to the massacres of El Fasher. The RSF went into Zamzam and internally a camp for internally displaced, where much of those who had been fleeing the RSF within other massacres in other cities fled to the RSF massacred Zamzam camp. This was in the lead up to this entire city's annihilation. Within 1 year, April 2023 onward, more than 15 million people were displaced. That was over a third of the entirety of the country's population. The entirety of Sudan's vital infrastructure, healthcare systems, education, telecoms, food, and water facilities completely collapsed. The violence has spanned Darfur, Kordofan, Jazeera, and Kordofan, meaning that both rural and urban populations are being targeted simultaneously. There has been a complete destruction and destabilization of, and that is the goal, a complete annihilation of the people, a clearing of the land and a statelessness. That is ultimately the RSF's goal and their sponsors, the UAE's goal, to create no longer a state that is called Sudan. I want us to understand what that mission within this past 3 years has been and how the gravity of what has happened and what is happening. I want to also talk about the RSF leaders. Hamidti has his roots in the Janjaweed Militia Alliance. This is the militia alliance that committed the genocide in Darfur. He recruited many of his fellow fighters in the Janjaweed, and from that, he went on to transform the force into his own private militia force, which was the RSF, and is now made up of mostly external mercenaries and is being utilized as a proxy force for the United Arab Emirates. The RSF, I want to emphasize, I don't think it's emphasized enough, the RSF has no popular support on the ground. This is largely seen as a foreign-backed force, a force that is made up of non-indigenous Sudanese people. Those who are coming in to occupy the land are not from that land. That's the nature of the occupation. And I want to, with the popular, the mass perception among Sudanese is that this is being done at the behest of the United Arab Emirates. So this is fundamentally different than anything that has happened in Sudan's history. This is a foreign power that has come in, that has systematically destroyed and provided the funding, the fighters, all of the operations, the arms. And that's a very important note that I would like to come back to. The arms, where are they coming? So that's a vital point. And this foreign force has now created and facilitated this genocide. So I want to be very clear about the differences, and the differences make are key to how we respond to this, not as an internal conflict, but as one holding accountable and stopping this external power that is making this happen.
Can we talk about Darfur from a tactical perspective for a second? As someone who watches each of the critical sort of steps in the past few years in Darfur primarily, but also across other parts of Sudan, from space with our team every day, and working with people on the ground, many of whom have died in Zamzam, that we work with in Al Fasher, they have been murdered in the past year. That I want to communicate something important about the difference between Darfur 1 and Darfur 2. Genocidal organizations are learning organizations. And so I want us to step back from morality for a second and just look from as objective as possible, tactical comparison perspective on Janjaweed versus RSF. The RSF has basically grown out, as you said, about growing out the Janjaweed as an organization that started with guys on horseback with AK-47s and field rifles, rusty Sterling submachine guns, now have an Air Force in terms of unmanned aerial vehicles. They have advanced command and control communications, and they have really perfected the use of 4 types of UAV platforms in what we call layered attack approach, or to use them for intelligence, sensor reconnaissance, comms jamming, comms intercept, and using them in a very sophisticated way. So we're seeing Rwanda, but if the genocide heirs of Rwanda had an extremely sophisticated military apparatus. And so we can focus on that part, but that's the x-axis. The y-axis of how RSF has represented this tactical shift is that between Zamzam and Al Fasher, between Janina to Zamzam to Al Fasher, each time they improved how they did the murder. And they made very significant adjustments. In Zamzam, they could not encircle the camp fast enough to prevent the Zagawa, primarily Zagawa, from fleeing the Zamzam camp, which is 12 kilometers to the south of Al Fasher, and one of the 3 big IDP camps around Al Fasher, Al Salam, Abu Shuk, and Zamzam. Zamzam was arguably one of the largest camps outside of Dadaab in East Africa, internally displaced camps. And so many people fled that with Al Fasher, they built a wall out of earth that was 9 feet high to be able, when they came in for the final kill, to trap the population and control their ingress and egress. And we've watched them tactically evolve how they massacre. And with, but one thing remained the same, the main priority for the killing was men and boys. And that was true across Janina to Zamzam and to El Fasher. The hardest thing for me personally out of Zamzam is I got called from people on the ground who I knew in one group that I want to identify, that a group of teenage girls were by a tree on the southern sector entrance to Zamzam. They were sitting as teenage girls do, talking, laughing. They had phones, and in came RSF and abducted them. And the call came from the ground that we had to go looking for them to try to find where these girls were taken into sexual sight. We were able to locate where some of them were, and we found the facility. Others we did not find. And so when we talk about the men and boys being murdered, we also need to talk about the use of conflict-related sexual violence, which is similar tactically to the first Darfur genocide, as a critical part, and often engaging in rape and sexual assault in front of the men before they're executed as a repeating pattern. And this is done intentionally. That has remained the same. What has changed is tactical learning, such as the berm, to try to trap them and not have witnesses get out. And then the other thing they've learned is how to work concealment from aerial observation in terms of how they dispose of the bodies.
I can add to the second part of your question was around lessons learned. That the Janjaweed was not immediately dismantled, and therefore the RSF was able to grow, this force was able to be co-opted by a foreign government, be expanded and funded into a more sophisticated network and group, and then it was able to undertake this genocide and take over the entirety of the country. And so if there's any lesson that should be learned, it's that for me, it's around the use of private militia groups. This is not a problem that is unique to the African context. Private militia groups, as an international lawyer that's working on corporate complicity, they exist in this gray area of international law. They are corporations, but they are undertaking these state military roles and operations, and they are like other corporations, do not have binding obligations on them that a military would have. And this is why al-Bashir even created put together this Janjaweed militia alliance. This is why governments use militias this is why the UAE is using this militia to undertake this genocide and not create its own, military force to overtake Sudan itself. It exists in this land of impunity. It can continue, this violence can continue because these private militias exist. I'll come back to very quickly. This is not an African problem. The US is not immune to this. We saw the Proud Boys here. That is an armed militia group. And that was not dismantled immediately. That was not addressed by this government, I would say, because this government, whatever the reasons may be, that militia group was not dismantled. And where are we now? Those same Proud Boys all joined ICE. And ICE is this militia force that is now expanded, that is now dismantling this society from the ground up. It is abducting children, conducting this ethnic cleansing campaign of anyone who is not white, and going after even those who are white, dismantling the very fabric of safety, what it means to go out and be safe in our societies. There's now this occupation by this militia. So I would very much emphasize all global powers need to take a look at the militias that are festering in their countries, understand that these private militia forces, especially given the legal impunity that they enjoy, must immediately be dismantled. Otherwise, the problem will expand until it takes over the entirety of the country.
Thank you all and I really appreciate the last part of bringing like the intersectional lens. And I just really quickly, we're going to kind of go on to the next phase of our conversation and hopefully open up to Q&A for all of you to have a part in the discussion. So I wanted for you, with the interview, to answer like 3 to 5 minutes, talk a little bit more about what angle you come to this work through. So I'll start with you because you started to talk about a little bit the accountability aspect of it for long-state groups and private militia groups, how there might be a lack of ability to have legal accountability as long as a human rights lawyer. What role do you see institutions like the International Criminal Court play potentially in getting justice in Sudan? And if they can't be found through formal bodies, I would like to talk a little bit about why you do work in Decolonize Sudan and organizing Sudanese communities for justice, especially like both Cameron and Nathaniel pointed out that largely Sudanese civil societies left out of the conversation.
Yeah, so the International Criminal Court should certainly prosecute Hemeti, all command ranks of the RSF, for genocide and crimes against humanity immediately. The ICJ should be ashamed of itself that it dismissed Sudan's case against the UAE for complicity in genocide in 2025, because this set a global, an international precedent that any country can opt out of the Genocide Convention. The UAE did so within this case, and the ICJ had every power and right to proceed with the case and hear the case of genocide against the UAE, and it did not do so. It can, to this day, can and should issue provisional measures to stop the UAE's funding, provision of arms, provision of fighters to Sudan via the RSF. It can do this given that there are, since 2025, there is an extensive body of new facts and new evidence around the fashion massacres, one amongst many of the RSF's crimes since 2025, that the ICJ has every obligation to address in provisional measures against the UAE. But I would urge all of you in this room, community members and organizers, if you're waiting for the ICC and the ICJ, don't hold your breath. These institutions are they take an extremely long time. I'll give one example is one of the Janjaweed commanders is only now being heard has now only now been prosecuted at the ICC. That's 20 years later, and so the ICC is not going to stop any type of genocide. The ICJ is not going to stop an ongoing genocide. It has proven that it will not do so with Palestine. And so also understanding that these institutions are shaped by politics. That's why no Western leader has ever been prosecuted by the ICC. And no colonial crimes or crimes of genocide have ever been prosecuted at the ICJ. And so organizing. I want to work where you are. Where we are is here in the belly of the beast in the United States of America, where my colleague Hudson, he mentioned that if this were happening in a Western country, let's explore that. If an unarmed group took siege of the United States, invaded New York City, took control of the US military, overtook the US military, this unarmed group was found to be backed by a foreign power, let's say Russia or China, would the United Nations or any other nation come in and say, well, US, you have to make peace with this unarmed group? No, that would be classified as terrorism. It would immediately be shut down with the national security apparatus. And so it's very, very clear when looking at the hypocrisy of if this were to happen in a Western country, the hypocrisy of how this is being handled. I want to also say the US's role in Sudan. So where are the arms coming from? They're coming through the UAE. UAE doesn't manufacture its own arms. They're manufactured here in the United States. And so, yeah, please do. But when we talk about what we should be doing from here, from our vantage point here, we should be stopping arms that are coming out of here to murder Sudanese people. And my colleague Nathaniel also brought up there has been no demand, unified demand coming out to address what's happening. There has been. Our Congress people have come together around a UAE arms embargo, stating that there is US intelligence now that links the UAE to these war crimes and these crimes against humanity. Under US law and under international law, the US has an obligation to stop sending these arms to the United Arab Emirates. It is the main weapons provider to the United Arab Emirates. And this has been a bipartisan policy, by the way, under Biden and Trump, sending this plethora of arms to the United Arab Emirates whilst committing these crimes. And so under Trump, this only increased. There was recently a billions of dollar deal to expand to increase the arms that were going into the UAE. So what you can do from your vantage point is organize. If you're a student here at Duke, when we talk about divestment, which is something that your fellow students have sought out, the divestment from the weapons companies that are creating all of this terror all around the world, in Palestine and in Sudan. They're the same weapons companies that are coming from here. So when we talk about Duke's divestment of its endowment funds from these weapons companies, this is something that you all as students could be organizing around, and many students have organized around, just making sure that that's intersectional with Sudan, that divestment from these weapons companies and from these defense contractors is happening with Sudan also at the top of mind, where these weapons are going, and supporting Sudanese-led organizing. MAB and our Sudanese youth here have put together Sudanese youth organizations, joining and supporting those organizations that are led by and for Sudanese people, I think are really fundamental. So when we talk about demands, also the next week is the reintroduction of the congressional of the legislative session, and so this will be a vital time for all of you to contact your Congress people. We've created a resource on our website, decolonizesudan.org, to talk them through what the arms embargo is, which Congress people have supported it. If your local Congress people are supporting it, you should be speaking with them directly. Why haven't you signed on to these bills in both the House and the Senate? UAE is committing all of these horrendous crimes. The US has a responsibility and obligation to stop sending these weapons. And so there's much that we can do from our vantage points that is much more effective than waiting for international institutions to act.
Thank you. I wanted to give Nathaniel an opportunity to respond to that.
I can do that later. I want to hear from Cameron.
Cameron. So Cameron, I know that you talked about a little bit about the US's current approach to the crisis in Sudan, and I wanted to talk a little bit and give you an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into the strategy, the strategic choice to engage. You talked about keeping relationships between states that we consider allies in kind of graces. So just giving you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that and to what extent you think that silence from the US at some points can be strategic. You could argue that case, and anything else you would know about the different actors. I think that we've heard a lot from Suad about the involvement of the UAE, so any additional elaboration you want to provide there.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it's worth just remembering that Sudan is not the only weak state with weak institutions in this region, right? It is bordered by and surrounded by countries that are arguably, many of them, even weaker than Sudan, right? We're talking about South Sudan, Central African Republic, Chad. These are countries that have become embroiled in this conflict. Ethiopia, Libya, Egypt, Eritrea, they are all involved. Every single one of Sudan's neighbors is involved, not necessarily at a state level. It's not necessarily the government of those countries that is involved. These are very remote areas, very porous borders. And we haven't said it, but maybe there's some level setting that needs to be done here. When we're talking about Sudan, we're talking about a country today that is the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. That's the size of Sudan, right? The size of Darfur, which Daddy's been talking about, is the size of Texas or France, right? So these are vast areas of territory with very little road infrastructure, with today no flight infrastructure other than drones, no commercial aviation anymore. So these are very remote areas, and so when we talk about these countries being involved, when we talk about arms networks flowing in, when we talk about these countries becoming instrumentalized by other more wealthy regional actors, there's a logic to all of that, right? Because when the UAE comes to the government of Chad and says, we need an airport with a landing strip that we can use to funnel weapons into the RSF, the government of Chad is more than happy to oblige because they're going to get $1.5 billion investment from the UAE. This is a desperately poor country, one of the 3 poorest countries in the world. So they're not going to turn down that opportunity. Similarly with the Central African Republic, similarly with South Sudan, all of which, if not their states, militia groups that operate in those countries are cooperating with the RSF, funneling weapons in and out, funneling fighters in, because again, these are countries with massive youth populations, right? The median age of all of these countries is somewhere between 15 and 19 years old. And the best opportunity for employment is to join a militia group. It's to join a fighting group on one side of the border or the other. You don't care, right? And so, so this conflict in Sudan has metastasized in ways that make it very difficult to resolve from Washington or Brussels or wherever from outside, because of the weakness of the states and the porousness of the borders, and as Natty said, the kind of failure of the international institutions and international legal norms to respond in a timely way to what's happening. It has been, as Suad has said, it has been perverted in some ways by the UAE or the Saudis or the Egyptians or the Turks or whomever it is, who see opportunity to profit, right, by selling weapons, but also to enhance their own kind of geopolitical, geostrategic position in Sudan, right? Because again, Sudan has 600 miles of Red Sea coastline, right? The Red Sea has become, in my estimation, if not the first, then the second most strategic body of water, at least this week after the Strait of Hormuz, right? So, and if you think that what's happened in the Strait of Hormuz has affected the global economy, wait until there is serious instability in the Red Sea, because you will see, even higher gas prices, you will see higher, geopolitical shocks from disruption in the Red Sea. And so Sudan occupies very strategic real estate in that respect. And if you are the UAE, or you are Turkey, or you are a kind of what they would call a middle power in the region, then the way to become a stronger middle power or a richer middle power is to have a vassal state on the Red Sea, a state that you control on the Red Sea, whose livestock you control, whose agricultural exports you control, whose billions of dollars of gold you control, right? And who will give you or allow you to park your naval frigates on the Red Sea wherever you like, whenever, right? That makes you, that moves you from a middle power to a great power pretty quickly. And there are a lot of middle powers in this region that have the ambition to be great powers, right? Because the United States has created a vacuum by stepping out, right? We used to be the great power that guaranteed freedom of navigation, that struck at terrorist targets in this region and tried to bring some degree of I don't want to say policing, but we use the international institutions that we helped to create to help bring some measure of order, whether it's through UN peacekeeping operations, whether it's through institutions like the International Criminal Court, what have you. And as we have stepped back, we have enabled the opportunity that we see all of these regional states now playing in Sudan. So we have brought this about ourselves, and the method by which we are trying to address it by cutting deals among elite leaders of these countries. My personal estimation is the way this war will end is not some kind of peace treaty like we saw with the signing of the comprehensive peace agreement that ended the North-South civil war in Sudan, which I was a part of those negotiations. That was an arduous negotiation that lasted over 5 years, produced a peace agreement that multiple U.S. administrations followed and respected and hewed to, that ultimately led to the independence of South Sudan. We aren't going to see that kind of a peace agreement. Frankly, you're not going to see those kinds of peace agreements anymore certainly not from the Trump administration, right? Even the peace agreement, the quotes, the peace agreements that they have signed so far in Rwanda and DRC, these are not comprehensive peace agreements that address the drivers of conflict in any of these countries. These are peace agreements that enable commercial deals. They enable business deals. They enable mining contracts. That is the peace deal is the means. The end is the cobalt mine, the gold mine, or whatever it is at the end of that peace agreement. And so that's the reality of the world that we live in 2026. And it's fully my expectation that if something isn't done differently, Sudan will simply be carved up by all of these countries that have a role in this conflict. And so you get the Jazeera agricultural scheme, you get the gold mines in Darfur, you get the gold mines in Red Sea State. This guy over here is going to take the gum Arabic. You're going to get a port because you sacrificed, and this guy's going to get the telecommunications contract, and we're going to carve up the choicest pieces of this country to appease all of these regional states and local actors who have fought in this conflict and who have invested. And I think the Trump administration will help to orchestrate that kind of a peace deal. It's not the peace deal that anybody wants. They will applaud it for bringing peace to the country and ending the suffering. That's a very, I think, jaundiced way to look at it, but I can't help but looking at how this resolves any other way right now. Because there is not a genuine, sincere, and deliberate effort to really understand why and how this country has been, brought to its knees in the last 3 years.
Thank you. And then we're going to turn to Nathaniel for the last question from me, and then we'll turn to y'all from the audience to ask your question. So you can answer you can talk to the point about the arms from the US that you wanted to speak to. And then I wanted to go back to what you said at the very beginning, power conceives nothing without a demand, and allowing you to talk a little bit about, as a researcher and as an investigator, the stuff that you find through that process, how it gives body to the demand that you could see be made in the future of Sudan. And then, like I said, anything else you want to touch on that's come up in discussion.
Yeah, so we have a lawyer, we have policymaker, diplomat, intelligence professionals. I'm, in a word, I'm a cop. And I don't know why I'm in academia 9 days out of 10. I was trained by cops. I think like a cop, and I only have 2 settings: doing homicide detective mode and SWAT. That's it. And so SWAT mode with Sudan is the deployment of strategic information to try, in special weapons and tactics and the police. If you can't take out the perpetrator, you try to change the terms of engagement. And so what we tried to do on Al Fashir for 2.5 years was to change the terms of engagement with the RSF. What we did yesterday with identifying the Asosa base with evidence consistent with RSF military support operations inside Ethiopia was about changing the terms of engagement. It's mostly desperate. It sometimes creates a lot of light and heat, but how much impact? Well, people are still alive. And so we do 2 things on the team. So that strategic deployment in that SWAT mode, and then the second is investigating crimes for accountability. We've been involved in the indictments against Vladimir Putin and Maria Lvova on Ukraine, and the 4 indictments by the ICC on attacks on power generation infrastructure in Ukraine. I cannot talk to you right now about ICC in Sudan, and you should think that's a good thing, and I can't tell you that. And so we do that really fine tooth comb work on the homicide side, which is doing an autopsy of a murder, of a massacre like Al Fashir and Denena. And we do a lot of that publicly, but actually we do more of it than you see not publicly, and do it in a way that's for chain of custody and admissibility law. And those things we don't talk about if we're going to have to testify. So, but on the SWAT side is trying to use unique capture of information through remote sensing, the fusion of remote sensing and open source, to try to, like a defibrillator on a patient with all of you guys, to try to get you to do something, right? And it's mostly totally depressing and infuriating. I mean, just on, looking at the lack of any consolidated action by the American people this time around in context to what happened the first time. And we can run a lot of critiques on the first time in terms of Darfur, and we should run those critiques. But we also can't miss the fact that was a moment where there was a demand from the American people, and it was heard by policymakers. It was heard across administrations in ways that related to actual policy action, including declaration of genocide by Secretary Powell, including appointing the peace, including supporting those missions. And so, as someone who served as an advisor in the UN mission in South Sudan in peacekeeping operations, I can tell you, and I've said this publicly, that when we first raised the warning within the US government about the risk to Al Fashir, we addressed the UN Security Council privately. And we said, you have basically at best to the end of the 23-24 rainy season. Basically you have, you have basically the end of the dry season before the start of the 24 rainy season. To act, and I was begging the Security Council to pull forces from South Sudan, the Rumbek-based Rapid Reaction Brigade, to just put something in the field around Al-Fashir. And now we know that's never coming. The cavalry's never coming. And we still have to keep trying to deploy information to create the conditions by which it might, but it won't. It won't. What I want to say on arms, I got personally told off by the Chinese government about 2 weeks ago. Don't tweet that. Can't stop it, but because I called them out in a private security UN Security Council briefing last month on gun run. And so the weapons you're talking about are not US made weapons per se. They're mostly from the Rinko Corporation in China. And the particularly the drones are from basically two Chinese companies, Norinco and Bingo. And often they splice parts between them. And then the weapons are basically Amazon dupes, like the artillery is AH-4, V1, V2s, which are a knockoff of the N277 US field artillery. And there's been Canadian, what's called MAVs from the Strait Corporation that we know are in the field. And so basically China has been the main provider to the RSF. Now, the point about US arms embargo is still very, very important, okay? Because the reason we left service with the US government is because we felt that we were getting pressure from inside the State Department and other elements of the national security community about how we were causing problems with the negotiation for the MDP, the Major Defense Partnership, that was signed in October by Biden with Mohammed bin Zayed in the Oval Office. We felt that our efforts to warn up to the National Intelligence Council and the National Security Council were being impeded by pressure from within the Biden administration to not mess up the Major Defense Partnership with the UAE. And so pressure by restricting arms and defense support to UAE from the United States does really matter, but I want to distinguish that from the weapons that on the combatant level that are in the field, you're seeing Dragunovs, Galils, you're seeing Makarov. Those are not American weapons. And so I want to make that distinction. But American pressure matters in America, and we should not be providing assistance to people who are arming genocide heirs. But the weapons are overwhelmingly, not all, but overwhelmingly from Chinese, also Serbia, entities like Golden Group, etc. So,
I think that this is, I mean, like this today, I think it's really important. It's a demonstration of why it's so critical to bring together different types of backgrounds and different angles to have conversations about what the path forward is and to really parse out the complexities of what we're talking about. And we have a little bit less time to do Q&A, as we started a little bit later. If I could suggest doing 5 minutes over, so we'll end at 7:35 if you don't have the time to stay. That'd be wonderful, but I think you have to step out, that's okay. But I'm going to turn it over to Mav to lead the Q&A in the audience.
Well, I was gonna say you were doing such a good job. You wanna really continue? I can ask a question. I have a question. As someone that's been only recently getting involved in the advocacy side of things, I've been part of like the Sudanese Youth Network for the past, I think, 12 months, and we didn't start thinking that we wanted to be advocacy focused. We started because we saw that the Sudanese community, which you guys can correct me, the Sudanese people here, I think in North Carolina, maybe an estimate of 10K, more or less, maybe more. I'm not really sure. There aren't like great statistics, but there are great pockets of Sudanese immigrants in North Carolina that have been here for a generation, some two, maybe more. But we noticed that there's no communication between people. There's a lack of education that a lot of the youth feel. Like a lot of young people feel like they're not confident. They don't have enough education about Sudan to speak about it. A lot of the older ones express similarly to what Nathaniel express a lot of disappointment and kind of like things are very depressing. They've been seeing the war going on for 3 years. They've been following up since the 2019 revolution. And it feels like both the youth and the older Sudanese folk have kind of given up, or there's a sense of like, what's the point of even doing anything? This war is a lot bigger than any of us. It involves a lot of actors, and it seems like they can't see kind of the purpose of doing anything, whether it's advocacy work, education, or work and when it comes to Congress. And I guess my question is, what would you say? But all of y'all have different expertise. You work in different parts, or in different like fields. So I'm curious, like, how would you respond to people that think, for example, Suad, that your advocacy work is not going to result in anything, that it's just kind of a waste of time? Because that is something that I hear directly from people, and it can be it's really disappointing to hear, but sometimes I struggle to respond to them.
Go read John Lewis's Walking Against the Wind, his autobiography. There's an incredible, surprising thing in that book by John Lewis, which is about the generational rift in the 1960s in the African American civil rights movement in the United States, where the older generation thought that John Lewis and the student movement was being too aggressive. And it was going to put him at more risk. And so the generational rift you're describing is not new. And you'll read Walking with the Wind that's not a unique problem. Okay. And I saw this with the Anglo-Sudanese community in London right now. There's a lot of generational stuff going on similarly. I think in any social change movement, there has to be lightning rods and there has to be institutional engagement. Okay, it's not one or the other. It's an orchestra. Don't focus on, often I will reprimand young people. You think there is a silver bullet, you have to pick the right answer. It's actually multiple answers at once from multiple directions. Don't push them away because they're not up here. Try to get them a little step and activate all the different angles you can. Play the orchestra. Don't focus on the instrument, right? And get them to move an inch. An inch leads to a foot. A foot leads to a mile.
If I can, firstly, I just want to point out around the Chinese weapons that most of these Chinese weapons are being bought and re-exported by the UAE. So it's still going through the UAE. They're just buying weapons from China because they're cheaper. But also, the point remains that the US is the main weapons provider to the UAE and has remained so throughout the duration of this genocide, has increased its arms supplies, only increased its arms supplies.
Agreed.
And so this, yeah, that point remains. I would first say, Matt, around your question, which is a brilliant question, is the reason our organization was created, Decolonize Sudan, is to bring together, strategize, and create accessible organizing campaigns and resources for Sudanese organizers. So we have a plethora of resources on our website, decolonizasudan.org, toolkits. We bring out Sudanese organizers to wherever you are, to wherever your community is, to talk about the very real action items that the students, those who stand in solidarity, anyone who wants to take action in Sudan can very easily take today, which is the first thing that y'all should do after this. Call your representatives and use our resources to do that at decolonizasudan.org. and demand, if they're not signed on to the UAE arms embargo bill, why aren't you signed on? Explain the situation. We have resources there for you to, even if you don't understand the situation, we have resources to understand and to communicate this to your representatives. We have some of the most power in this room being, as constituents, and also in our power to disrupt this arms flow. I will say around Cameron's point, Mr. Hudson, I'm sorry, Mr. Cameron's point. I think, Cameron, I think you are greatly underestimating the power, the strength of Sudan and Sudanese people. I think to call Sudan a weak state, Sudan is the nation that brought together the globe and the region to say no normalization with Israel. This was the global conference that came together that was organized by Sudan and faced off with empire, directly. This is the Sudan and its people are so extremely strong and resilient. The mutual aid of Sudanese people is the only reason Sudanese people are alive today in this annihilation campaign. This is, to me, the most resilient people in the world. They're facing our people are facing the worst conditions globally, this largest crisis happening globally, and despite this, they are surviving and creating these networks to survive. The Sudanese state has retaken Khartoum and will continue to complete armed resistance against the RSF. Because that is the only way. It's not through peace deals, not through the Berlin conference that's happening next week, where the EU has brought in Aziz, the RSF government, and has excluded the Sudanese government from these international talks to resolve what's happening in Sudan. None of those talks will do a thing because Sudan will resist and Sudan will eventually oust the RSF as it has been doing in the last year. And so this resistance will continue. I genuinely believe that Sudan will not only win, it will thrive, it will become one of it will become what it actually is. Sudan is one of the richest nations in this world. It is a cradle of human society. That is what Sudan is. And I would implore you to look at Sudan's larger history and even its most immediate history. This is not a failed state. This is not a weak state. And its people are some of the most resilient in the world. And we will win. So I want you to understand that. I want you to know that and understand that. And stay connected with your organizers who also understand that and are working towards because the organizing of the Sudanese people, and I think the diaspora organizing is really central around not only the mutual aid, but also the advocacy to stop the arms flow, to stop the root cause of this happening. So I'll leave it at that, and I would encourage you to if you haven't already, check out our resources at decolonizesudan.org. Where we have a plethora of organizing resources and things that you can plug into, even just as a constituent to talk to your congressman.
I think we have time for one more quick question and then one response from one of our panelists. So if you could direct your question to one person, that would be super helpful. Super respectful those times. I think you were first, so I'll take the back. Sorry to the folks that we weren't able to get to.
Go to them. You hear me now? Oh, I am originally from Ethiopia, and it breaks my heart. It's fine, and just say I my families lived in Sudan as refugees, like in the 80s, and recently my people also lived in Sudan refugees. You know, always wait for Sudan people. It's like people have it's difficult people, but they all have just great words to that about Sudan. Sudan people So it really breaks my heart. There's people all this related happen is involved with those multiple matter. My question is that the United States they exam that it has how they even do that with that increase in all of Africa at the mercy of regional powers and particularly will be started in the entire region of the public government in the ways and we are seeing the stuff that get rolled somebody. But this probably is not only that the West have paid the budget, but I think this is that way will also matter. So the USA is not thinking in active role, you cannot find stop. It's not like important that they really have very vast. But my question is, I mean, those bring about moves to against this is that like people of the issue started there also analyzed of the US. So one thing that always was exclusive why the UAE has this land of the US plus one with something like because recently the government action Somalia of this kind of state UAE the different in Ethiopia they are obviously UAE recently the American has looked at them. Even the farmers came out with slogans under what the UAE is not any country. So the entire union is very fast. And I would like to get insight into why the UAE is really with this commitment they would have stuff like the navigation and the basically in the other communities they not a people. So if you give us this outside why the UAE is things in doing.
I think that if you're incorporating to a question of the question the outside role that is the framing here that the UAE is an outside role, but it's not playing an outside role.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the question. I think you're right. And you're right also that it's not just Sudan, right? It's Libya, it's Chad, it's Central African Republic, it's South Sudan, it's Ethiopia and Sudan where UAE is playing an outsized role. I think there's a number of reasons why you are seeing UAE employ the strategy that it is. I think it's worth remembering we're talking about a country the size of Delaware that has a population of 1 million native Emiratis. Right, 10 million live in the country, but those are essentially guest workers, either white collar Brits and Americans in the banking sector, or 8 million Indians, Pakistanis, and Filipinos that serve everyone else in that country. Right, so that's the kind of the demographic makeup of this country that sits next to Saudi Arabia, a country 25 times the population, with similar amounts of wealth, but with a far greater territorial reach. Right, it reaches from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea, the entire Arabian Peninsula, and so there is this competition with Saudi Arabia. And I think that both countries, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, set upon a path of development more than a decade ago. But Saudi Arabia chose to develop internally, right? It's building out its infrastructure, it's building out its non-oil economy, tourism, these new fabulous cities in the desert. It chose to develop internally. But the UAE doesn't have the size to develop internally because it is the size of Delaware. So it had no choice. If it wanted to grow its economy, if it wanted to diversify its economy, if it wanted to grow its stature, it had to do it externally, right? And it's not going to do it in a strong neighbor like Saudi Arabia. It's going to do it in places where its money is going to go a long way, right? And that's in places like Yemen. It's in places like the Horn of Africa, right? And so I think, at a very early stage, before the Turks, before the Saudis, before other regional actors saw the investment opportunities in Africa, and specifically in the Horn of Africa, the United Arab Emirates was there. They are now by far the largest investor in the region and on the continent, more so than China in the last year. They've just overtaken the Chinese, right? Which is saying something for a country that has only 1 million people, right? But they have become this investor of such size. I spoke to a colleague at the State Department about this not long ago, because I had the same kind of question that you're posing, right? And what they told me, and the way that they think about it, was that, you know, you have this country with fabulous wealth that's really only about 50 years old, not even quite 50 years old, right? So there's a certain hubris of youth that comes when you are as young as you are and you are as wealthy as you are. You think that you can remake the world in your image. You think that you can shape the outcome of world events. You think that you can shape the outcome of conflicts. You think that you can back a non-state actor over a state actor and have that turn out okay, because you haven't learned those lessons. You haven't learned the lessons of imperial failure that the United States has learned, and frankly hasn't quite learned enough, right, in the last month, but that European powers have learned, that other powers have learned over the course of failed interventions over the decades. They are just now learning those, right? And they were kicked out of Eritrea a few years ago after the war in Yemen. They did not internalize what happened there. They are applying this model that we see in Sudan, in Libya, back in Khalifa Haftar, in that conflict there, in Yemen, in a whole host of countries, right? So I do think that they are in many ways driven by this very large neighbor in Saudi Arabia, trying to get out of that shadow, trying to diversify and enhance their wealth. At the same time, they are preying on weaker states where their money can buy them political access, can buy them commercial opportunities, and trying to enhance their regional standing. I would also add that the United States and Washington, D.C. is very much part of that strategy, right? They own half of downtown Washington right now, right? The convention center in Washington, D.C. is owned by the UAE, right? They have pledged to invest $1.5 trillion in the United States economy, right? They are a major non-NATO ally of the United States and one of the largest purchaser of United States weapons. So it comes at a higher cost, but they are buying political access and buying influence in our nation's capital, exactly like they are doing in all of these countries that are surrounding Sudan. So we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that that they're only having this level of success in fragmented states or in weak states in Africa or poor states in the region. That's not true. They're having similar success in buying that access in the United States. The last thing that I would point to is that UAE in 2020 signed the Abraham Accords with the state of Israel, brokered by the Trump administration. And that has bought them an enormous amount of goodwill with this administration, with the Biden administration. They have made peace with Israel. I think people would now argue that the Abraham Accords are not an interfaith peace treaty, but it is a political, commercial, and security pact whereby Israel and the United Arab Emirates are pursuing a shared regional agenda. And whether that is in Iran today or in Sudan, you see a high degree of coordination between Israel and the UAE in their regional approach to security, right? And you're seeing that in the Iran conflict today, where you have the Emirates making statements that they will join the United States and Israel in allowing their country to be used for aggressive flights over Iran, that they will patrol along with the United States the Straits of Hormuz. They are stepping up intentionally in ways that European partners are choosing not to align themselves even more closely with the Trump administration and Israel in this conflict in Iran. So they have positioned themselves politically, very astutely with the United States, using commercial influence and political influence on Capitol Hill, not just with the White House. And you see that strategy in perhaps more rudimentary ways, but no less insidious ways across the entire Horn of Africa region. And again, I think it's because they have ambitions to be a greater power than they are. They have ambitions to be outside of the shadow of a much larger, Saudi neighbors. And they have the hubris of youth to think that they can reshape this region in a way that advances their long-term interests and agenda.
Thank you so much. If Olivia could join me in thanking Father. Thank you for staying to the end. I will keep it short. As students, I want to speak directly to students. You all have a role to play tied to very powerful institutions. As a student at university, whether you're at Duke, whether you're at UNC, NCCU, North Carolina State, there is a history here. Nathaniel talked about the Save Darfur movement. There are records that you can look at in the library about students that came before you that organized around that. They organized around divestment from South African apartheid. They organized around divestment from Israel. You can look at the past movements that you can be a part of today. I also, again, because I'm not alone with Duke. Recently, I know that the undergraduate students passed a referendum around the endowment transparency. That's something that you can take part in today. Just thinking about how you got 3 really good examples of the different ways in which you can engage in advocacy. So I just encourage you to not let the conversations up here, take it with you, talk to your peers, your friends, your family about it, and just do what you can do here every day to really live and take this gift that they gave you and do something with it. So thank you.